most people say, if you don't like it here, get out. That's for spineless people. Spineless bastards who don't want to fight for what they believe in.
Report of the Presidential Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. Chapter 3. Financial Ties, Harvard and the Slavery Economy. Slavery may have ended, at least officially, in Massachusetts by 1783, but the ties between Harvard University and slavery continued. Beginning in the colonial period and continuing well into the 19th century, the university and its donors benefited from extensive financial ties to slavery.
Veritas is the motto of Harvard University. On our shield, the word is displayed across 3 open books, suggesting both our mission of education and the transparency that's demanded of us.
In this chapter, 3.1, New England and Caribbean Slavery. 3.2, Harvard Affiliates, Slavery, and the Slave Trade in the Colonial Era. 3.3, Harvard Affiliates, Slavery, and the Slave Trade into the 19th Century. For roughly a century, Harvard had operated as a lender and derived a substantial portion of its income from investments that included loans to Caribbean sugar planters, rum distillers, and plantation suppliers. After 1830, the university shifted its investments into cotton manufacturing, before diversifying its portfolio to include real estate and railroad stocks, all industries that were, in this era, dependent on the labor of enslaved people and the expropriation of land. Harvard's financial ties to slavery also take the form of major gifts and bequests from donors, who accumulated their wealth through slave trading, from the labor of enslaved people on plantations in the Caribbean islands and in the American South, and from the northern textile manufacturing industry, supplied with cotton grown by enslaved people held in bondage. 3.1, New England and Caribbean Slavery. Harvard's financial ties to slavery are multifaceted, and the economic links between colonial New England and the Caribbean provide critical context to understand such entanglements. Trade between New England and the West Indies proved so essential to both regions that one 17th century observer declared Boston the mart town of the West Indies. As early as 1667, the governor of the English colony of Barbados acknowledged that these colonies cannot in peace prosper, or in war subsist, without a correspondence with the New England colonies. This view of Boston Harbor from the 1720s shows a thriving port town, in keeping with New England's status, according to one British member of Parliament, as the carriers for all the colonies of North America and the West Indies. Thomas Carey Whittam, a southeast view of the city of Boston in North America. While large-scale plantation slavery never took root in New England, for more than a century, Boston merchants played an essential role in sustaining the sugar plantation economy of the Caribbean. Many of those same merchants were important players in Harvard's early history. New England ships carried enslaved people and critical supplies to the Caribbean islands. They brought back slave-produced commodities like sugar and molasses, most of which was then re-exported throughout the British Empire. As early as the 1630s there were already more than 20 ships plying trade between New England and the British Caribbean. As Edmund Burke observed in 1757, New Englanders became carriers for all the colonies of North America and the West Indies, and even for some parts of Europe. They may be considered in this respect as the Dutch of America. Here, too, we begin with Governor John Winthrop. As the historian Wendy Warren has observed, to understand New England not only by the labor done within its colonies but even more by the commodities that came and went, is to understand New England as John Winthrop did, by its place in the world. Winthrop saw the region's profitable trade with the West Indies, in particular, as a gift of God for the benefit both of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's economy and its reputation. It pleased the Lord to open to us a trade with Barbados and other islands in the West Indies, which as it proved gainful, so the commodities we had in exchange there for our cattle and provisions, as sugar, cotton, tobacco, and indigo, were a good help to discharge our engagements in England. And this summer there was great a drought, as their potatoes and corn, etc., were burnt up, and divers London ships which rode there were so short of provisions as, if our vessels had not supplied them, they could not have returned home, which was an observable providence, that whereas many of the London seamen were wont to despise New England as a poor, barren country, should now be relieved by our plenty. This sculpture of Massachusetts Bay Colony Governor and Harvard Overseer John Winthrop is displayed in Annenberg Hall, Harvard College's first-year dining hall. Timber was of particular importance to New England merchants engaged in the triangle trade. Because ships could be built and rigged in New England using only the produce of the region's forests, shipbuilding became a significant facet of its economy. And with so much Atlantic trade focused on slave-grown commodities, Boston merchants soon became central to that industry as well. In 1700, Governor Richard Coode wrote that more good vessels belonged to Boston than to all Scotland and Ireland. Timber from New England was also used to build and rebuild the Caribbean's sugar plantations, whose infrastructure required constant replacement. More than 75 hurricanes struck the region between 1700 and 1775. Trading connections grew stronger throughout the 18th century, as Caribbean planters relied on New Englanders to provide the vital supplies required to maintain the plantation complex. New England's fishing industries fed the West Indies sugar plantations, sending refuse fish, salt burnt, spotted, rotten, and carelessly ordered to the Cherub Islands, Barbados, Jamaica, and sea who feed their Negroes with it. Dried cod from New England was the meat of all the slaves in all the West Indies. This 1784 map by a Harvard student includes careful labels of the islands of the Caribbean and major ports in Central America. Importantly, these provisions imported from New England allowed West Indian planters to allocate far more land to sugar than would otherwise have been possible, enabling the system to grow. In Barbados, for example, after an unsuccessful attempt in the first decades of the 1600s to produce tobacco, planters turned to sugar as their primary crop. By the 1670s, Barbados produced 65% of the sugar sold in England. Initially, sugar was a scarce commodity and commanded very high prices in European markets. In 1647, at which time about half of Barbados's arable land was used for sugar, Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop received a letter stating that planters in the island were so intent upon planting sugar that they had rather buy food at very dear rates than produce it by labor, so infinite is the profit of sugar works once accomplished. As other colonies followed Barbados into the market, however, supply increased and prices fell sharply. To remain profitable, planters were forced to devote an ever greater percentage of land to the crop. By 1767, the share of Barbadian land producing sugar had risen to 80%, which meant that virtually all land useful for agriculture of any kind was devoted to this one crop. As the amount of land dedicated to sugar production increased, so too did the number of enslaved laborers needed to work it. According to one estimate, the population in the mid-18th century across the Caribbean encompassed approximately 725,000 enslaved people and just over 250,000 whites. In the English colonies to which New England was most closely tied, the divide was even more extreme. This 1665 illustration of a sugar mill notes the blacks who service the mill and push the cane between the rollers as item L on the listing of parts of the machinery. In short, New England merchants provided Caribbean sugar plantations with vital supplies, which enabled planters to remain profitable and expand the brutal business of slavery far beyond anything they could have otherwise sustained. In return, New Englanders acquired capital and slave-produced goods that were essential to their trade throughout in the Atlantic world. This cycle was New England's economic bedrock. In 1783, John Adams wrote, "The commerce of the West India Islands is a part of the American system of commerce. They can neither do without us nor we without them." 3.2 Harvard affiliates, slavery, and the slave trade in the colonial era. It is not possible to document here all the many gifts that Harvard received from donors whose wealth was tied up in Caribbean slavery and slave trading, both because of incomplete data and because the precise ways in which donors' profits are connected to sugar production and Caribbean slavery are not always clear or easy to trace. Certain examples stand out, however, and these notable bequests, which proved critical to Harvard's growth and the establishment of its reputation as a prestigious university, warrant specific mention. Isaac Royall Jr. Perhaps the most well-known gift to Harvard by a donor involved in slavery is the bequest of Isaac Royall Jr., whose family's sugar plantation on the Caribbean island of Antigua furnished the wealth that endowed the Royal Professorship of Law, Harvard's first chair in law. The plantation proceeds also allowed the Royalls to purchase their Medford, Massachusetts, estate, now a museum and historical site, where Isaac Royall Jr. enslaved at least 60 individuals. Harvard Law School benefactor, Isaac Royall Jr. supported his family's lavish lifestyle at their mansion in Medford, Massachusetts, with the wealth generated by enslaved laborers on his sugar plantations in Antigua. The Royal House Association purchased the property in 1906, and today the Royal House and Slave Quarters is a museum that seeks to educate the public about the meanings of freedom and independence before, during, and since the American Revolution, in the context of a household of wealthy loyalists and enslaved Africans. The Out Kitchen building, adjacent to the Royal Mansion, is the only known extant separate slave quarters in the northern United States. Yet the Royals' wealth and Harvard's first professorship of law are not the whole story. Isaac Royall Jr.'s sister, Penelope Royall Vassall, owned among other enslaved people, Cuba Vassall, and her children. Cuba had been brought to Cambridge by Penelope and Isaac's father, who left Cuba to Penelope when he died. Meanwhile, Penelope's husband, Henry Vassall, had brought another enslaved man, Tony Vassall, to Cambridge from Jamaica. Cuba and Tony married, and Cuba and their children were eventually sold to John Vassall, Henry's nephew and a 1757 graduate of Harvard College. Among the children was Darby Vassall, who is a remarkable figure in his own right, an important player in Boston's free black community and an early activist for black rights. His life and activism helped to illustrate a critically important theme embedded in this report: black resilience, agency, and achievement in the face of persistent discrimination. Darby Vassall and Black Resistance. While the extraction of wealth, directly and indirectly, from the labor of enslaved people is the primary focus of this section of the report, the individual contributions of enslaved people, not only their unfree labor but also their resilience, agency, and achievement in the face of violence and discrimination, are vital to a complete understanding of our past and have for too long been overlooked. The life of Darby Vassall, also the subject of a virtual exhibition jointly presented by the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket and the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, is particularly striking. Born in Cambridge in 1768 and enslaved by John Vassall, Darby was an advocate for equal rights and abolition of slavery throughout his life. With the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, John Vassall, a loyalist, left his property, today the Longfellow House National Historic Site, in the care of Darby's parents, Tony and Cuba. Darby, then a small child, was living at the house when General and later President George Washington moved in and made it his headquarters, while he oversaw the American colonial forces fighting around Boston. Later in his life, Darby would tell the story of an interaction with the general himself. Washington personally offered Darby work. Darby asked how much he would be paid, and Washington retracted the offer. General Washington, Darby recalled, was no gentleman, to expect a boy to work without wages. After slavery was made unlawful in Massachusetts in 1783, Darby's parents purchased property just north of Harvard's campus. His father, Tony, operated a stable in what would become the free black community of Louisville in Cambridge. Darby eventually moved to Boston, where he owned property just blocks from the State House, and fought alongside other members of Boston's black community for equal rights locally and abolition nationally. In 1796, he was a founding member of the African Society, a mutual aid association for black Bostonians. In 1812, he was one of 6 signers of a petition to the state legislature requesting funding for the education of black children. The African School Association named in the petition was a forerunner of the Abill Smith School, which today houses the Museum of African American History in Boston. Darby also actively supported the New England Anti-Slavery Society with both his time and his money, and he used his personal connections to benefit the black community. He counted many prominent abolitionists of the day, including Wendell Phillips and William Cooper Nell, among his associates. In 1855, he visited his birthplace, bringing the self-emancipated slave, memoirist, and activist Lunsford Lane along to meet the house's new proprietor, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a funder of abolitionist causes. At the age of 91, Darby again joined his friends and neighbors in Boston's free black community to petition the Massachusetts legislature, this time demanding legal protections for the black community against slave catchers emboldened by the Fugitive Slave Act. Darby died in 1861 and was buried, at his own request, with his parents' former enslavers in the Vassall family tomb. It is located under Christ Church, near the place of his birth, and within sight of Harvard Yard. Fellow commoners, Harvard's colonial elite. Harvard's economic ties to the slave trade and Caribbean slavery in the colonial era were not just a matter of major benefactors, such ties were also visible on campus, including in financial transactions between individual students and the university. Some students, often sons of wealthy New England merchants or Caribbean plantation owners, paid their tuition in plantation commodities like sugar, molasses, and cocoa. These goods, produced by enslaved labor, were luxuries of significant value. Louis Vassall, for example, ostentatiously paid a portion of his tuition with a cask of sugar worth more than the entirety of many of his classmates' dues. It was advantageous for Harvard to cultivate relationships with families in these lucrative industries, and in many cases, the university would benefit from their patronage for generations. In Harvard's first century, the school capitalized on its small contingent of ultra-wealthy students by making it possible to purchase special privileges and status. Modeled on a similar system in place at Oxford and Cambridge, students willing to first pay £100 to the college treasurer and then pay double tuition money were granted the distinction of fellow commoner. Early on, fellow commoners were also required to present a piece of silver. Fellow commoners' privileges included dining at the faculty table, being excused from going on errands, and having the title of masters, and the privilege of wearing their hats as masters do. While records are incomplete, nearly all known fellow commoners at Harvard had ties to slavery. This effectively made students of slave-owning families an elite on campus. In 1729, John and William Vassall, younger brothers of Lewis, each presented Harvard a silver tankard with their names and family arms inscribed. These tankards, received as payment for the Vassall's fellow commoner status, became part of the university's collection of ceremonial silver. Samuel Winthrop. The Royals were just one of many families whose slavery-begotten wealth supported Harvard, both before and long after Isaac Jr.'s bequest. In 1645, George Downing, a nephew of Governor John Winthrop and former tutor at Harvard, circa 1643 to 1646, toured the British West Indies and delivered sermons in many of the island's churches. As he headed home to England, he penned a letter to his cousin John Winthrop Jr. encouraging him to migrate to the West Indies to make his fortune growing cash crops with enslaved labor. Colonists in Barbados have bought this year no less than 1,000 Negroes, and the more they buy, the better able they are to buy, for in a year and a half they will earn, with God's blessing, as much as they cost. Downing went on to explain that Negroes, the life of this place, were far better than New England servants to work West Indian plantations, as white colonists were none of the fittest for those parts. John Jr. did not take Downing's advice, but his younger brother Samuel Winthrop, the governor's youngest son, did, dropping out of Harvard in 1645 and making his way first to Tenerife, in the Canary Islands, and, a year later, to the West Indies. Samuel became one of the first large-scale sugar producers in the British West Indies, eventually owning the rights to 1/4 of the island of Barbuda as well as a sugar plantation on Antigua where dozens of enslaved people labored to produce tens of thousands of pounds of sugar a year for export to New England and Europe. He also served as the deputy governor of Antigua from 1667 to 1669. Winthorpe's Bay on the north side of the island memorializes the prominence of Samuel and his descendants in its early colonial history. Although Samuel never returned to New England, he remained deeply connected to the region, and to Harvard in particular. Before leaving Massachusetts Bay in 1645, Samuel, Downing, and 2 other Harvard graduates had jointly gifted land to the university, the first donation of property by alumni. The parcel, which was planted with apple trees and came to be known as the Fellows' Orchard, is today the site of Widener Library. In an early letter to his father, the governor, Samuel asked to be remembered to family members and to our most esteemed president, Henry Dunster. Many years later, Samuel would send 4 of his sons to New England to be educated with the express purpose of eventually enrolling them at Harvard. In correspondence with his brother John Jr., then the governor of Connecticut, Samuel asked for help getting his sons admitted to the college. Ultimately, he could not see these plans through. In 1667, after a French attack on Antigua ruined his plantation and decimated his enslaved labor force, Samuel wrote, "It is now all I have left besides my land and 12 working Negroes, with whose hard labor I shall not be able to keep my sons in New England." Despite this setback, Samuel's finances eventually recovered, and he died one of the wealthiest men in Antigua. 3.3 Harvard affiliates, slavery, and the slave trade into the 19th century. Harvard continued to benefit financially from the proceeds of enslaved labor well beyond the end of slavery in Massachusetts. During the first half of the 19th century, more than a third of the money donated or promised to Harvard by private individuals came from just 5 men who made their fortunes from slavery and slave-produced commodities. 4 of these men were directly involved in slavery or the slave trade, while the 5th, Peter C. Brooks, became the wealthiest man in New England by insuring New England's merchant ships. In the 19th century, Boston Harbor remained a bustling center of world commerce. Harvard donors were among the many merchants whose ships carried food and other raw materials out of New England to supply plantations in the Caribbean and American South. They exchanged these goods for sugar, coffee, tobacco, and, increasingly, cotton to be sold in European and Northern American markets. James Perkins bequeathed $20,000 to Harvard for the Perkins Professorship of Astronomy and Mathematics, which the university created in 1842. His business, Perkins and Company, pursued a global strategy that included Caribbean slave trading, Western land speculation, and opium trading in China. Perkins and other members of his extended family are also integral to Harvard in other ways. They played a central role in the creation of Massachusetts General Hospital, and the Perkins Room in Massachusetts Hall, the primary conference room used by Harvard's president and other senior leaders, is named for a descendant of this family. Benjamin Bussey, a sugar, coffee, and cotton merchant, left Harvard an estate valued at $320,000 to be divided among the Divinity School, the Law School, and a school for agriculture. Today, the Arnold Arboretum is located on Bussey's former estate in Jamaica Plain. By the time Harvard received this bequest, the net value of the trust had increased to roughly $400,000. John McLean, another merchant, endowed the McLean Professorship of Ancient and Modern History in 1834 and supported Massachusetts General Hospital's Department for the Care of the Insane, the forerunner of McLean Hospital. Finally, Abbott Lawrence, who owned and operated cotton textile factories in Massachusetts along with a trading firm that marketed and distributed the products of his mills, donated $50,000 in 1847, followed by an additional $50,000 at his death in 1855. These gifts established the Lawrence Scientific School, the institutional predecessor of the Graduate School of Applied Science that would also encompass Bussey's Agriculture School. The Lawrence Scientific School's most eminent faculty member would be Louis Agassiz, recruited on the recommendation of Lawrence, who also personally paid Agassiz a salary for a time. Eventually, these institutions would evolve into today's John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. These donors, among other significant benefactors, are discussed in more detail in the sections that follow. While not comprehensive, these examples illustrate the multifaceted ties between Harvard's major donors and slavery, the slave trade, and the trade in slave-produced goods. The Perkins brothers, James Thomas Handacid and Samuel Gardner. When Thomas Nelson Perkins died at his home on October 7, 1937, his friends and colleagues commemorated his contributions as a servant of Harvard and a leader among Harvard men. Perkins, a graduate of the college and the law school, served as a fellow for 30 years. He was a prominent lawyer and statesman whose memory would be enshrined at the very heart and center of the university he loved and served. The Perkins Room in Massachusetts Hall, for use by the president and senior leaders of the university, was inaugurated on January 6, 1941, in his honor. Thomas Nelson Perkins was a scion of the wealthy Perkins family, which had, at the time of his death, supported the university for more than a century. The family's wealth originated in the slave economy of the American South and especially the Caribbean, where Thomas Nelson's great-grandfather, Samuel Gardner Perkins, and great-uncles, James Perkins and Thomas Handacid Perkins, Samuel Gardner's brothers, began building their fortune as slave traders in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. These three Perkins brothers, James, Thomas Handacid, and Samuel Gardner, were each significant Harvard donors in their own right, and they bequeathed their estates to descendants who became prominent leaders at the university, among them Elizabeth Cary Agassiz, the first president of Radcliffe College. The Perkins brothers, active philanthropists, supported Harvard and several other important institutions. James bequeathed $20,000 to the university in 1822 to establish the Perkins Professorship in Astronomy and Mathematics, renamed the Perkins Professorship in Mathematics in 1906, and served as a director of the effort to create the Theological School of Cambridge, now Harvard Divinity School, to which he and Thomas Handacid both donated. James and Thomas Handacid also led the effort to create the Massachusetts General Hospital and served in turns as chair of trustees and vice president. Thomas also served as the hospital's second president. As trustees, they were deeply involved in the initial fundraising effort, which raised nearly $150,000, and donated $5,000 each. Their brother Samuel Gardner gave a further $100. Thomas Handacid and Samuel Gardner also supported the creation of the Massachusetts Professorship of Natural History at Harvard, now the Fisher Professorship in Natural History. Beyond Harvard, the Perkins brothers helped to establish several prominent organizations in Greater Boston. James left his mansion on Pearl Street, valued at $40,000, to the Boston Athenaeum, one of the nation's oldest independent libraries and cultural institutions. And the Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts, is named for the family, specifically Thomas Handacid, who bequeathed his Boston mansion as a site for the school. The Perkins brothers' parents and a grandfather were involved in the West Indies trade, so the brothers understood well, as did other New Englanders, the wealth that could be made in the Caribbean. The French colony of Saint-Domingue promised the opportunity to make a fortune. In the fall of 1782, long before the brothers became active as philanthropists, a 21-year-old James boarded the merchant ship, Beaver, to Cap Francais, modern-day Cap Haitien in the north of Haiti. The city was then a bustling metropolis and the capital of Saint-Domingue, the Pearl of the Antilles in the French colonial imagination. It was built upon a rigorous racial hierarchy with a small white planter class at the top and enslaved Africans who worked the island's sugarcane, coffee, and cotton fields at the base. At the height of its economy in this period, Saint-Domingue imported as many as 40,000 enslaved men, women, and children per year by one estimate, due in part to the high mortality of enslaved people on the island's sugar plantations. Another source estimates a total of 700,000 enslaved people were imported to Saint-Domingue before the start of the Haitian Revolution in 1791, making it the single greatest exploiter of enslaved people in the Caribbean. James wrote letters from Saint-Domingue to family in New England, as did his wife, Sarah Payne Perkins, after she traveled to join him on the island. In November 1789, Sarah Perkins described her new home to a correspondent, lingering over a description of the sons and daughters of slavery, whom she believed have their oppressions and even their wants, but their enjoyments are proportionate, and I am very apt to believe that the cup of slavery is embittered with less gall than we are wont to imagine, for though the taskmaster may lift his whip against them, still their minds are unaffected and they appear as destitute of that smart which is keener than the anguish of the field, as their fellow mules. I have seen many of them who appeared to be susceptible of the greatest pleasure you can imagine and, who were apparently discovering an enthusiastic enjoyment from their wild disorderly gambols, but never was once witness to anything like that grief of heart, that affliction of the mind, which is the offspring of sensibility. James joined the firm Wall, Tardy & Co. as a commission agent for American merchants, purchasing colonial products made by enslaved people to ship to New England. When his younger brother Samuel Gardner turned 21, he, too, sailed for Saint Domingue. Samuel Gardner later recalled, "The flourishing state of trade and the prosperity of Saint Domingue's inhabitants were without a parallel perhaps in the world, for here there were no poor, I may say, either black or white, for even among the latter those who were slaves were well taken care of, fed and clothed, and well sheltered by their masters, and those that were free were able to get a living without excess labor." The brothers entered into a partnership with Walter Burling to form Perkins, Burling and Company. The firm traded in the products of slave labor including sugar, molasses, coffee, and cocoa, as well as enslaved people themselves. Thomas Handasad managed the company's business in Boston, while James and Samuel lived primarily in Saint Domingue. On the island, they visited vessels in the Cap Francais harbor to select enslaved women, men, and children for purchase, sometimes boarding ships to choose from among newly arrived Africans, and then selling them to slave owners on the island. They also depended on ship captains and other third parties to sell enslaved captives throughout the Caribbean, especially in Havana, Cuba, and Kingston, Jamaica. The Perkins business correspondence is extensive and documents commercial activities in Cuba, Curaçao, Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Martinique, Puerto Rico, St. Croix, and Trinidad. Other merchants and slave traders sought letters of introduction to the brothers to gain access to the Perkins, Burling and Company network. Those who profited from economies of slavery may have convinced themselves that the enslaved were unaffected by their captivity, but the enslaved and their descendants tell a different tale. The African-American artist Jacob Lawrence's 1937 Toussaint L'Ouverture series boldly depicts the terror of the slave market. In 1791, a rebellion began in the mountains of Cap Francais that threatened the slave economy of Saint Domingue and, by extension, the Perkins wealth. In December of that year, a business partner wrote to James lamenting your present situation and informed him that one Colonel Murray had in contemplation of sending a small vessel to assist in removing Mrs. Perkins and your family. James and his wife remained in Saint Domingue, however, until the burning of Cap Francais in 1792 led them and many of the colony's prominent slave holders to flee to Havana, New Orleans, Baltimore, and New England. James took with him an enslaved man, Moose, who allegedly helped the family escape. Although Perkins's memoir states that the family freed Moose, he remained attached to them in New England. Samuel Gardner stayed behind. James continued to administer the family business, remaining in regular contact with Samuel Gardner regarding activities in Saint Domingue, even as the colony was engulfed in war. In May 1792, Samuel Gardner wrote, "The day after I purchased his Negroes there was not one for sale in the place. Endicott was obliged to wait some time and finally deposit in the hands of a captain going with N to Havana a sum of money considerably more than the value of 8 slaves to get the privilege of carrying that number down in his vessel." As the situation deteriorated, Samuel Gardner kept James apprised of the difficulty both of acquiring and disposing of new cargoes of slaves. By October 1792, he was reporting on the continued flight of the white population. He returned to New England in 1793, married, and became a partner in his father-in-law's mercantile house of Higginson & Co. Samuel Gardner eventually entered the insurance industry and served as president of the Suffolk Insurance Company of Boston. He would later recall his experience in Saint Domingue as he advocated against emancipation in the United States, asking abolitionist women to contemplate the horrors of degradation which must fall on their own sex throughout the southern states if they were to succeed, and warning of misery not only to the innocent whites, but misery and tenfold wretchedness to the slaves themselves, for this would as certainly follow a general rising of the blacks, or an immediate emancipation of them, as effect follows an operating cause. James and Thomas Handaysid redirected their primary business interest to the opium trade with China and sought to recast themselves as wealthy benefactors through generous gifts and bequests. They were successful in this regard. When Harvard President Josiah Quincy wrote his 1840 history of the university, he described James as among benefactors of Harvard College, entitled To Grateful Remembrance. Quincy wrote of James: his professional career was commenced in Saint Domingo, where he established a commercial house, and conducted a prosperous business until he was compelled to leave the island by the insurrection of the colored population. At the hazard of his life, and with great loss of property, he escaped from Saint Domingo, and returned to the United States. Soon after this event, he formed with his brother the commercial house of James and Thomas H. Perkins, which afterwards established a professional reputation second to none in North America. By the amount and discriminating nature of their bounty for the support of learning and the relief of suffering, and by their readiness to aid in every patriotic design, they have rendered their names synonymous with public spirit and benevolence. Israel Thorndike. In 1818, the Beverly, Massachusetts, merchant and slave trader Israel Thorndike paid $6,500 for a large collection of maps and books from the estate of Christoph Daniel Ebeling, a professor of Greek and history. This collection, which Thorndike donated to Harvard, contained one of the most complete and valuable collections of works extant on American history available at the time, and came to be the core of the Harvard map collection, the most valuable single collection in existence. Israel Thorndike's early business ventures primarily involved shipping supplies to the Caribbean and using the proceeds to purchase slave-produced goods for sale in European and American markets. He used his wealth to support the Harvard Libraries, the nascent Harvard Divinity School, and Massachusetts General Hospital, among other institutions. Besides the landmark Ebeling map collection gift, Thorndike, together with his son Israel Thorndike Jr., donated $2,100 to Massachusetts General Hospital. In 1815, he served as vice president of a society for the promotion of theological education in Harvard University, which, with Thorndike's support and that of other wealthy patrons, notably James Perkins, who also served as an officer in the society, established what is now Harvard Divinity School. Thorndike himself donated $500 to that fundraising effort and a further $500 for the purchase of theological works. He also gave $500 in 1806 to support a natural history professorship and a further $100 in 1820 for a professorship of mineralogy and geology. Like the Perkins brothers, Thorndike's descendants were deeply involved at Harvard too. Augustus Thorndike was a renowned 20th-century Harvard Medical School faculty member, and a professorship at the Massachusetts General Hospital bears the family name. Thorndike's business interests also intersected with those of the Perkins brothers. He built his fortune primarily exporting flour and fish to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and buying slave-produced goods like coffee, sugar, molasses, and rum to sell in US and European markets. Thorndike traded in enslaved women, men, and children as well, buying slaves in one port to sell at another. In a 1791 letter to the captain of one of their ships, Thorndike and his business partner wrote the following orders: purchase from 5 to 14 good Negroes, as the price may be, and lay in such food for them as is best suited to preserve their health, and proceed to the Havana, in the island of Cuba. You be very careful to keep them well secured at all times, and on your arrival you sell them for the most that can be obtained, and purchase as much molasses as your vessel will stow, leaving room only sufficient to stow the goods you may purchase with your surplus cash, which you vest in sugar, cotton, or hides. Like many merchants, Thorndike and his partner engaged in small-scale slave trading between Caribbean islands, emptying their holds of supplies in major ports like Cap Francais, modern Cap Haitien, and purchasing enslaved people who could be sold at the next port of call, where a ship's holds might then be filled with molasses, sugar, cotton, and other slave-produced goods. While such transactions may have been a relatively small part of Thorndike's overall business dealings, it is clear that he engaged in slave trading over the course of many years leading up to the Haitian Revolution. Thorndike ultimately shifted like the Perkins brothers to the China trade, as well as to investments in New England's textile industry. 3.3.1 Trade in Slave-Produced Goods. John McLean. In his 1840 The History of Harvard University, Josiah Quincy wrote that John McLean disposed of his large estate in a spirit of general benevolence, equally useful, exemplary, and just. From an original bequest of $50,000, left in trust at the time of McLean's death for the support of his widow, the university eventually received $25,000 to endow the McLean Professorship of Ancient and Modern History. Massachusetts General Hospital, the first teaching hospital associated with Harvard Medical School, also received nearly $120,000 from McLean's estate. This gift was monumental, more than a fifth of the total amount of bequests received by the institution in the 4 decades following its 1811 charter. The gift was equivalent to 8 years of the hospital's annual operating expenses at mid-century. For his generosity, the division of the hospital dedicated to the treatment of mental illness was renamed in McLean's honor. McLean Hospital, now an independent Harvard-affiliated hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, still bears his name today. In 1840, Harvard President Josiah Quincy wrote of the benefactor John McLean that he prosecuted trade with great skill and success, chiefly with the interior of New England and the West Indies. Like many other New England merchants, McLean made a fortune selling timber products to Caribbean plantations in exchange for sugar, molasses, and other slave-produced goods. McLean made his fortune in the slavery-entangled trade with the West Indies that powered the Massachusetts economy from the colony's earliest days. According to Quincy, McLean prosecuted trade with great skill and success, chiefly with the interior of New England and the West Indies. Like so many Massachusetts merchants, including his father, he shipped lumber from New England to Caribbean plantations. He then purchased sugar produced by enslaved people to sell in Europe and the United States. Between 1793 and 1795 alone, McLean is listed as an owner of 10 ships registered in Boston and adjacent Charlestown. A list of spoliation claims submitted to the federal government by U.S. merchants seeking to recoup their losses on merchant voyages captured by the French in the 1790s notes McLean as an underwriter on 8 separate voyages, including shipments of foodstuffs, dry goods, and wood products to the West Indies, cargoes of slave-produced goods, including sugar, coffee, tobacco, and their derivatives, from the West Indies to the United States and Europe, and, in one case, a shipment of slave-produced goods from the American South to Europe. Benjamin Bussey. In his 1835 will, Benjamin Bussey explained at length his reasoning for leaving a significant portion of his wealth to Harvard University, namely his desire to advance the prosperity and happiness of our common country. He wrote, "In a nation whose government is held to be a government of laws, I deem it important to promote that branch of education which lies at the foundation of wise legislation and which tends to ensure a pure and uniform administration of justice, and I have considered that in a country whose laws extend equal protection to all religious opinions, that education which tends to disseminate just and rational views on religious subjects is entitled to special patronage and support. Benjamin Bussey made a substantial fortune trading in slave-produced goods from the Caribbean and the southern United States, as well as lending money to southern plantation owners. His name is found across Harvard today on professorships at the Law School and Divinity School and on locations around the Arnold Arboretum, which occupies the land he bequeathed to Harvard in 1842. Bussey left half of his estate to Harvard to support theological and legal education and the establishment of a school of agriculture, botany, and other natural sciences. The net value of his bequest, when the university received it in 1861, was just over $400,000, enough to establish Bussey professorships at Harvard Law School and Harvard Divinity School, as well as the Bussey Institution on the property Bussey left to the university, now the Arnold Arboretum, in Jamaica Plain, Boston. In recognition of these gifts, a marble bust of Bussey is displayed in Annenberg Hall, the freshman dining room in Memorial Hall. The Harvard Portrait Collection also contains a likeness captured by the famed American portraitist Gilbert Stuart. In a brief handwritten memoir composed near the end of his life, Bussey emphasized his humble origins as the son of a poor New England farmer, his service as a quartermaster during the American Revolution, and his work night and day to establish himself as a goldsmith in Massachusetts after the war. He devoted less than a paragraph, however, to the period during which he amassed his fortune. He only briefly noted that he supplied many traders in Providence, Newport, and all ye country round, and did not mention that many of the traders he supplied would have been engaged in the West Indies trade. At this time, the slave trade in Rhode Island, long an important center, was approaching its peak. In 1790, Bussey tells us, he moved to Boston and worked as ID in Dedham, day and night, did a large business, owned several ships, engaged in many kinds of mercantile adventures for about 15 years. Other sources detail these adventures. Records of spoliation claims include multiple vessels owned by Bussey and voyages he underwrote. More than half of these voyages originated in the United States and were bound for the Caribbean with supplies that New England merchants had long provided to island plantations. Bussey also provisioned the plantation economy in North America. As early as 1789, he invested in a voyage carrying supplies to New Orleans, including flour, building materials, farming implements, and hundreds of yards of tow cloth, a rough fabric routinely used to make clothing and bedding for enslaved people. The ship returned north with a cargo of tobacco. By the early 19th century, Bussey's business ties spanned the American South, necessitating that Bussey have representatives on the ground. In 1802, his son-in-law traveled to Savannah on his behalf to collect on numerous debts. Messrs. Chapman and Weston were expected to pay in tobacco, while Ebenezer Jenks of Louisville, Kentucky, was expected to remit payment in the form of cotton. Such arrangements were typical, and Bussey often shipped such goods, produced by enslaved people in the West Indies and the American South, to Europe, where he sold them and purchased fabrics, dinnerware, and other goods for U.S. markets. Bussey frequently did business with other Harvard donors, part of a tight-knit community of wealthy Boston merchants and businessmen with ties to the university. Among his French spoliations claims are merchant voyages underwritten or co-owned by Thomas Handacid and James Perkins, Israel Thorndike, and John McLean, each discussed above. Bussey also invested in the Lawrence Manufacturing Company, owned by Abbott Lawrence, discussed below. And Bussey's attorney, Samuel P. Fay, is the namesake of Fay House, the principal administrative building of the former Radcliffe College, today the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. During the latter decades of his life, Bussey's focus shifted to business interests in New England. He owned property across the region, including extensive holdings along Boston's waterfront that city officials repeatedly sought to acquire for city projects. This included land bounding on Yamhill Creek south of N Street and north of the town dock, part of what is now the Quincy Market Complex, which Josiah Quincy, then mayor of Boston, purchased for the city in 1824. At the time of his death in 1842, Bussey still owned large swaths of the city, a country estate in Roxbury, now Jamaica Plain, a woolen manufactory in Dedham, and extensive property in what is now Maine. After Bussey's death, it fell to Quincy, now the president of Harvard, to thank Bussey's widow on behalf of the corporation. Like his business dealings in life, Bussey's final bequest illustrates not only the links between Harvard and economies of slavery, but also the close ties that bound the Massachusetts elite, merchants, businessmen, and politicians, to one another and to the university. Edwin F. Atkins. Examples until this point all date to the era in which slavery was legal in the United States, if not in Massachusetts. Yet Harvard connections to slavery persisted even after the end of the Civil War. In 1899, for example, the Boston-based sugar magnate Edwin F. Atkins granted $2,500 to the Harvard botanist Oakes Ames to begin research on the possible development of new, better strains of sugar cane through selection and breeding at the Atkins family's Soledad plantation in Cuba. Cuba had by the 1830s replaced Saint Domingue, Haiti, as the most prominent slave economy of the Caribbean, and the Atkins family had been exporting sugar and molasses from the island since 1838, some 30 years before the beginning of Cuba's gradual abolition of slavery. In 1868, at the beginning of the 10 Years' War, Cuban independence leaders declared emancipation, and enslaved people who fought on either side were granted their freedom, setting in motion a slow and halting path toward the end of slavery. Meanwhile, during the war, American investors, including the Atkins family, extended credit to Cuban plantation owners. By the end of the 19th century, such investors had acquired most of the plantations in Cuba. Atkins, looking to expand into sugar production, acquired Soledad Plantation in 1884. 4 years earlier, the Spanish government's 1880 abolition law had established an 8-year period during which nominally free formerly enslaved people were labeled apprentices, or patrocinados, and compelled to continue working for their enslavers. This system was, in effect, slavery by another name. In fact, before Atkins purchased Soledad, the plantation's owners sent a bill of sale to his business partners that listed 177 patrocinados as slaves, despite their new legal status. When E. Atkins and Company officially acquired the plantation, it came with at least 95 formerly enslaved patrocinados. Like many Cuban plantation owners, Atkins depended on patrocinados to work his plantation at Soledad. Although slavery ended in Cuba in 1886, the law forced these individuals to continue working on the plantations where they had been enslaved. Edwin Atkins's correspondence with his plantation manager immediately after he took possession reflects a preoccupation with reducing labor costs in order to compete with other producers. They discuss strategies to retain control of the black workers, as well as the extraction of payment for releasing workers from indentured servitude, apparently including some who were already free by law. By the end of the century, Atkins had expanded the estate from its initial 900 acres to 12,000 acres of land in the hills and mountains of Cienfuegos. A section of this plantation became a Harvard biological research station at the turn of the 20th century. In later years, scholars and students would test varieties of sugar cane on the property and develop new ways to eradicate diseases. To provide sustained support for this work, Atkins presented to the university initial payments on an endowment fund which, between 1919 and 1925, would come to total nearly $200,000. In 1932, Soledad officially became known as the Atkins Institution of the Arnold Arboretum, Harvard University. Harvard's involvement was suspended in 1961, in the wake of the Cuban Revolution, and the site is now managed by the Cuban government as the Cienfuegos Botanical Garden. 3.3.2 Southern Slavery and Northern Textile Manufacturing. Harvard's ties to the Caribbean and to wealthy planters and traders is a critical part of the story of the university's financial involvement with slavery, but it is not the whole story. With the development of industrial capitalism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the plantation economy evolved, and cotton began to take center stage. By the middle of the 19th century, as the historian Sven Beckert observed, cotton manufacturers and merchants in the United Kingdom stood at the center of a world-spanning empire, acquiring slave-produced cotton from the Americas for their mills and selling cotton products to the most distant corners of the globe. New England and its vast textile mills followed, and Harvard affiliates' deep connections to this lucrative industry, fed with cotton produced by enslaved people primarily in the American South, are another important part of the university's story. Abbott Lawrence. In his 1846 to 1847 annual report to the Board of Overseers, Harvard President Edward Everett shared a plan of organization for an advanced school to provide systematic instruction in those branches of sciences which are more immediately connected with the great industrial interests of the country. Disciplines of instruction included chemistry in its various applications to the arts of life, engineering, geology, and zoology. The plan was approved in February 1847, but the university lacked the funds necessary to construct new buildings and hire relevant faculty. Textile magnate Abbott Lawrence, whose Massachusetts mills processed cotton grown by enslaved people in the American South, donated more than $100,000 to Harvard to support the creation of a school to train students in the practical sciences. Lawrence also personally funded race scientist Louis Agassiz's salary for years. This uncertainty quickly resolved. In June 1847, the Boston industrialist Abbott Lawrence announced his donation of $50,000 to defray the expenditures necessary for the scientific school, including the erection of suitable buildings, the purchase of apparatus, furniture, as well as comfortable support of the professors and other teachers employed. The new school would train Harvard students in the practical sciences, to prepare engineers, miners, machinists, and mechanics for skilled employment in America's rapidly industrializing economy. Everett remarked that Lawrence's munificent donation was at that time the largest sum ever bestowed on a place of education in this country, in one gift, by a living benefactor. The new scientific school was named in Lawrence's honor and, upon his death in 1855, he bequeathed an additional $50,000 for the further advancement of the said school. Today, Lawrence's gifts support endowed professorships in the Lawrence Scientific School's successor, the Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Lawrence Hall was built in 1848 on the site of the present-day Science Center with funding from textile magnate Abbott Lawrence. After the Lawrence Scientific School was absorbed into the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Lawrence Hall was the home of the Graduate School of Education from its founding in 1920 until 1962. The founder and namesake of the town of Lawrence, Massachusetts, Lawrence was co-owner of the A&A Lawrence Company, which managed the Lawrence Textile Manufacturing Company, and president of both Atlantic Cotton Mills and Pacific Mills, two major textile factories. He also served in the U.S. Congress and as United States Minister to Great Britain. Lawrence had a personal as well as professional stake in the development of educational institutions that would teach scientific knowledge as then applied to the practical arts, which he viewed as critical for industry generally and for textile manufacturing specifically. He did not merely donate funds but directed how the money should be utilized. He also personally recommended and, for several years, paid the salary of Louis Agassiz as professor of zoology and geology. As discussed below, Agassiz would play an outsized role in the university's intellectual life and promotion of race science. Lawrence's descendants would continue to be deeply involved with the university. His nephew, Amos Adams Lawrence, expanded the family business and its philanthropic donations to Harvard and other institutions. Abbott Lawrence's grandson, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, served as president of Harvard from 1909 to 1933 and was heir to not one but two prominent Boston families, the Lowells being another family whose considerable wealth derived from textiles, and which also counted notable abolitionists. As president, Abbott Lawrence Lowell would preside over the creation of a residential college system that excluded black students and be a leader among Harvard faculty who supported eugenics. The wealth that Abbott Lawrence amassed through textile manufacturing and trade, like the fortunes of other northern industrialists of the era, is inextricably tied to enslaved labor. Lawrence's mills were staffed by free northern workers, but they depended upon cotton produced by enslaved people laboring on southern plantations. Denied access to education, after emancipation many black children labored in the fields alongside their parents to help support their families. The cotton they picked fed the looms that produced the wealth of textile magnates like Abbott Lawrence. After emancipation, many African Americans remained tied to the plantations where they had been enslaved. Before and after the end of slavery, the northern textile industry depended on the cotton produced and picked by exploited black women, men, and children. James Greenleaf and other cotton factors selected and stored cotton bales, sold the commodity to various commercial houses, and transported the raw material on freight trains and ships to the northern United States and across the Atlantic. Abbott Lawrence's mills were among Greenleaf's customers. Transactions between northern manufacturers like Lawrence and southern slaveholders operated through the factorage system. Southern planters relied on factors, commercial agents, to negotiate the sale of commodities, chiefly cotton in the 19th century, produced by their enslaved laborers. Factors selected and stored the cotton bales, kept abreast of the price of cotton on the world market, and sold the commodity to various commercial houses. They then transported the raw material on freight trains and ships to the northern United States and across the Atlantic. The cotton they traded was the source of incredible wealth in the global economy. As the historian Walter Johnson has written, the southern plantation system converted lashes into labor, into bales, into dollars, into pounds sterling, and it made men like Lawrence into wealthy entrepreneurs and philanthropists. Lawrence had at least two agents in the South, one based in Richmond, Virginia, and one based in New Orleans, Louisiana. He corresponded with both on the cost of cotton on the world market and political events in Europe that could affect commodity prices. William Gray, an agent for Lawrence's Atlantic cotton mills, traveled between Boston, Lawrence, and New Orleans as he handled business transactions for the mill. In the course of his work, Gray corresponded with Greenleaf and Hubbard, a firm in New Orleans that traded in cotton from southern plantations throughout the Mississippi Valley, and which had its own Harvard links. James Greenleaf. James Greenleaf, co-owner of Greenleaf and Hubbard, was the son of Harvard's second Royal Professor of Law, Simon Greenleaf. He was also a philanthropist and the builder of Greenleaf House, the historic Brattle Street mansion purchased by Radcliffe College in 1905. Greenleaf House served as the residence of Radcliffe College presidents and, more recently, deans of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. James Greenleaf and his wife Mary built Greenleaf House, seen here in a 1902 photograph taken by a Radcliffe College student, to be close to their families, his father, Royal Professor of Law Simon Greenleaf, and her brother, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, both lived nearby. Radcliffe College acquired the house in 1905 as a residence for its president. In the 21st century, Greenleaf House is the home of the Dean of Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Greenleaf and his wife, Mary Longfellow Greenleaf, sister of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, divided their time between Cambridge and New Orleans, where Greenleaf and his business partner, Daniel Hubbard, operated from Canal Street. The violence of slavery, and the auction block, would have been in full view throughout Greenleaf's personal and professional life. His primary business was the purchase of slave-grown cotton, generally by way of factors, and the sale of it to major northern mills like Abbott Lawrence's. Due to the structure of these transactions, it is difficult to determine precisely which plantations supplied Greenleaf and Hubbard, but we do know that among them was Briarfield, owned by Jefferson Davis, the U.S. Senator from Mississippi and soon-to-be President of the Confederacy. Also the site of Davis's personal residence, Briarfield stood on Davis Bend, a peninsula in the Mississippi Delta with rich alluvial soil and direct access to the cotton market via the river. Greenleaf and Hubbard worked with the firm Payne and Harrison, co-owned by Jacob U. Payne, who was not only a factor and a slave trader but also the most intimate friend Jefferson Davis ever had and, according his obituary in the Washington Post, the largest cotton dealer in the world.